Welcome back to my visual podcast series, Tales of Adventure. This is already episode number 8 from Cuba. Viva la Revolución with Tarek Rasouli in 2002. The photos were taken by Stefan Eisend. The story was written by myself and edited by my wife Carmen. By the way, never mind the goatee I was sporting. I mean, I barely recognize myself on these photos. But before we get started, I would like to introduce to you my partner and longtime friend of this adventure.
Hi, I'm Tarek Rasouli. Hans and I have been friends for probably 30 years or so. And Hans asked me back when I was a professional writer if we're gonna go to Cuba together. He did all those adventure trips, and I knew already the trips he did in the past with Steve Pete and a couple of other guys around the world, and Cuba sounded really good. It was back in 2002. We actually had a really good time. I had no idea what it would be like, but it was amazing and really funny times with Hans always. And actually, it was one of my last trips, though. I had no idea what would happen a few months later when I crashed and broke my spine and ended my career.
This time we ventured to Cuba, a Caribbean island 90 miles off the coast of the continental USA. My fellow adventurers were German throw rider Tarek Rasouli and photographer and cameraman Stefan Eisend. We had just completed a grueling 3-day trip across the Sierra Maestra mountain range, the pinnacle of which was climbing Cuba's highest peak, the Pico Turquino. Research before the trip determined for me which bike I should take. My choice was a hardcore freeride GT iDrive Ruckus, and for Tarek it was his Rocky Mountain RM7 at 46 pounds. Ouch! We knew that there would be most likely a considerable amount of hike and bike involved, where one has to carry or push the bike, but nobody had anticipated 11 hours of brutal schlepping. I had arrived a few days prior in Havana to meet up with our local guide. The plan was to meet Tarek and Stefan a couple days later in the southern part of the island to start our adventure. At the time, Americans were not allowed to travel to Cuba, and I was able to travel on my Swiss passport via Mexico to Havana. Our guide, a former doctor who had its license revoked after he was caught in an attempt to flee Cuba years ago. He spoke German and English and was the perfect man to help us handle all the local logistics. Upon arrival, I realized that the preparations for this trip hadn't really been taken care of. Communication with the guide prior to the trip was very limited, with internet and emails, especially in Cuba, practically not existing or working. We wanted to avoid the big tourist resorts. At the same time, we needed the freedom to travel and transport our gear. And sudden impulse made me rent an RV. It seemed to be the only choice if we wanted to be able to do what we had planned for and to experience the real Cuba and its people. It was a long journey to drive to Santiago de Cuba, where we met our German partners. The single-lane highway was narrow and crowded with pedestrians, farm animals, potholes, and buses. It was way too dangerous to drive after dark. For a warm-up ride, we went to Parque Nacional de Gran Pietra, which was, as its name indicates, a giant rock slab on top of a mountain overlooking Cuba's second biggest city, Santiago, on one side, and on the other we could see Guantanamo Bay, which only recently had made a name for itself in the news. This American-controlled part of Cuba was at the time barely known. In the afternoon we explored Santiago. We must have seemed like aliens to the locals with our crazy bikes and outfits. Our guide cautioned us to keep things very low-key, as gatherings of groups of people were strictly forbidden by the communist government. Us demonstrating our skills at some death-defying walls and drops, as well as handing out stickers to the kids, was rather the opposite of low-key.
Yeah, Santiago was kind of a cool session we had. It was a bit of jibbing, Hans with his trials riding, me more with a free ride and BMX style. But I was on my big bike, 7-inch bike. It wasn't probably the best thing to hit, but it helped on the steep wall that we rode and also down some drops. Good times.
Let me tell you a little about Cuba's history and politics, which are a little bit infamous. In short, Cuba belonged to Spain, thanks to Christopher Columbus. For a few centuries until 1898, it then went to the USA, but not for long. In 1902, it separated from the United States and gained independence. However, it did agree to lease to America a block of land, actually a bay, called Guantanamo. Let us fast forward. Between 1956 and 1958, Cuba was locked into a revolution. Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and his many supporters overturned the government. As we got ready for the main part of our trip to traverse the Sierra Maestra mountain range, we camped at a turquoise-colored beach on the shores of the Caribbean Sea. People are unspoiled and friendly, but not particularly highly motivated. There are some strange laws and regulations which make the most simple things very complicated, like for example fishing. We had a craving for some fresh fish for supper. That should be an easy request when staying on a Caribbean island. Well, think again. It took us more than 2 days and a bribe to the village mayor before we found someone who was prepared to secretly sell us some red snapper, since ironically fishing was illegal. It was equally hard to find gasoline, and we could only find a few gallons on the black market, since the few official gas stations were all sold out. We bought some of our meals from a local government-run restaurant. They literally cost only 20 cents, including a Coke to wash it down with. In total contrast, a few miles down the road, there was a fancy beach resort, which we avoided on our trip. This was packed with foreign tourists that pay several $100s for their meals and never get to see the real Cuba. It seemed right that our first stop was the Comandancia de la Plata. Hidden in the jungle, this was the old revolutionary headquarters of Fidel Castro. It was amazing to see the infrastructure that had been set up in the middle of nowhere in order to plan the Cuban Revolution. Old black and white photographs of Fidel and Che Guevara reminded visitors of those days. But not much has changed since. It seems as though Cuba has been trapped in a time warp. It is still very similar to the Cuba of the 50s. People still live here in a very controlled environment. Both residents and tourists are often under both physical and electronic surveillance. After our little detour to the old revolutionary headquarters, it was time to start the main part of our trip in San Domingo. We were now making our way up and over the mountains towards Pico Turquino. The first day consisted of a grueling 7 hours of uphill, hiking and biking with only a few short descents which were rendered almost unrideable due to the steep incline and gigantic tree roots that would cover the trail. We were very relieved when the evening came and we were able to find a rustic shelter to spend our first night.
It was such a little, very, very simple hut, just a wooden hut, and there was some guy there that prepared the meals for the trekkers and also for us. We were watching the guy actually when he was in his little kitchen making us food, and we were out there watching the beautiful views and had a bit of a drink, took a bottle of wine with us, and enjoyed it a lot. It was awesome.
Day 2 started with another 4 hours of climbing before we reached, totally exhausted, Cuba's highest point, measuring just a little over 2,000 meters tall. Over the years I have done many arduous hikes with my bike, but due to the combination of the humidity, the steepness, the heat and our relatively heavy bikes, this one was tough. We realized why no one had ever tried to bring their bikes to the top before, and we also worked out why the locals were calling us locos. Still, it wasn't the first or the last time that I have been called crazy in one language or another. The 4 hours of technical downhill rewarded us with incredibly beautiful scenery along the way, but the endless steps, stairways, and even ladders made it no less challenging or exhausting than our ascent. At the end, what a glorious sight, the sparkling blues of the Caribbean Sea way below us and the location of our campsite for the night.
Yeah, that was a super hard day. I remember the trails really well. It was there were wooden ladders, there were handrails. You had to sometimes carry your bike down. We tried to ride it down. It was really challenging, and I loved it on the one hand, but it was also very unpredictable because it was humid and hot. But once we made it to the summit, we were well rewarded, and then on the other side of the mountain it was much more open and nice trails down and faster and not so overgrown. So it was it was great. And then still on the way down we were reaching another farm, and we stayed there overnight, had another beautiful home cooked meal from the guys there, and I remember having a cold shower in this super simple little outdoor shower. That was funny.
We awoke to our third and final day traversing Pico Turquino. The 3 of us felt very rewarded to finally have some trails which were not as blocked and a whole lot of fun to ride. If not for modern bicycle technology, as in 2002, I really don't think this trip would have been possible. Without a doubt, those trails would have been unrideable if we hadn't had hydraulic brakes and a minimum of 5 inches of suspension. The last section of the trail led us along the spectacular coastline. Cuba is an astounding location, and there are definitely a lot of trails waiting to be discovered on bicycle. Tarek, Stefan and I were extremely fortunate to have been able to explore and enjoy the island. The incredible footage and photos we brought back with us are testimony to the outrageous beauty of this unique country that seems to be stuck in time. Cuba Libre, cigars, Che Guevara, Viva Cuba. I hope you liked this episode. Please check out the little edit on my YouTube channel, or click right here. And please like the story, share it, comment on it, and a big thanks to Tarek for his commentary. Viva Mountain Bike!